Have you ever just felt completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information you're expected to retain on a daily
Oh,
basis?
constantly, yeah.
Right. Because if you are anything like me between work, school, or just, navigating the endless stream of data in modern life, it can feel like you are constantly trying to pour the ocean into a thimble.
That is a very apt metaphor, honestly.
Yeah, you read an amazing article, you nod along to this brilliant presentation, and then 3 days later, blank. Poof. Gone.
It's completely erased.
Exactly. But what if, instead of frantically searching through a disorganized, messy mental filing cabinet, you could walk into a grand, beautifully structured building inside your own mind?
Which sounds wild when you first hear it.
It really does. Imagine just strolling down a sunlit hallway, turning into a specific room, and simply picking up the exact facts you need right off a mental coffee
It
table.
really does sound like magic.
Yeah.
Or maybe some kind of science fiction superpower, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we are so culturally conditioned to treat human memory as this inherently unreliable, leaky bucket.
Yeah, a bucket with a massive hole in the bottom.
Exactly. So the idea that you could consciously engineer a physical, navigable space in your mind just to store and retrieve data on demand,
Yeah.
it feels almost superhuman.
It's pitched as the ultimate life hack. We've all seen the fictional detectives on TV who retreat into these vast cinematic archives in their minds, right? They freeze time and solve crimes by zooming in on a clue they saw like 3 weeks ago.
Right, the glowing floating text in the air and all that.
Yeah, exactly. But here's the thing for you listening today. We've pulled together a massive stack of research, historical documents, and cutting-edge neuroimaging for this deep dive, and it proves this isn't just Hollywood fiction.
No, it's very real.
It is a very real, very ancient, and scientifically validated technique. So our mission today is to separate that pop culture myth from the hard science. We're going to explore how this technique actually rewires the mechanics of how you retrieve information.
And most importantly, we're going to teach you step by step how to build your own functional internal architecture.
Yes. But okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can start pouring a concrete foundation for any kind of mental architecture, we need to sort out the terminology.
We really do. I think we should set expectations right up front, though, because the myths are so pervasive.
Good point.
The goal here is not to suddenly give you a quote-unquote photographic memory where you record the world like an infallible 24/7 security camera.
Which would be exhausting anyway.
Right. And it's a complete misunderstanding of human cognition. The real goal is to fundamentally change how you organize your thoughts. It's about taking abstract, floating data things that have no physical shape and giving them a permanent physical address in your brain.
Okay, so if you go online and search for this, you'll see a dozen different buzzwords thrown around. What exactly is a mind palace?
Well, mind palace is actually a very popular, somewhat informal catch-all phrase. In the scientific literature and historical texts, the formal term is the method of loci.
Method of loci.
Yeah, loci being the plural of the Latin word locus, meaning places. So it is literally the method of places.
Yeah.
But we have to make a very crucial distinction here.
Because people mix this stuff up constantly, right?
All the time, people
Yeah.
constantly blend several entirely different psychological phenomena together under this one mind palace umbrella. And honestly, it leads to a lot of frustration.
Right, because as I was combing through the psychology research, I noticed there are basically four distinct categories that get tangled up. First, there is the traditional memory palace, which is the strict, formal mnemonic technique used specifically for storing and retrieving facts.
Right, that's the method of loci.
Exactly. Then second, there is a symbolic inner landscape. And this is a psychologically meaningful imagined place, maybe used for therapy, meditation, or just organizing parts of your identity.
Like a safe space visualization.
Yeah. Third, there is a paracosm, which is a sustained fictional world. Think of the intricate fantasy worlds kids create in childhood play, like the Bronte sisters writing epics about imaginary kingdoms.
Oh, sure, building a whole universe.
And finally, a cognitive map, which is just the brain's baseline internal representation of spatial relationships, like simply knowing where your kitchen is relative to your bedroom.
Right. And mixing those four things up creates a tremendous amount of confusion. So, let's zero in on the method of loci. It is a highly specific cognitive tool.
So how does it actually work structurally?
It follows a very rigid formula. Information leads to an image or association, which is then intentionally placed in a specific location, creating a retrieval route.
Wait, so you aren't just sitting in a chair imagining an apple floating in a black void?
No, not at all. You are imagining a very specific, perhaps bizarrely large neon green apple sitting on the real-world couch in your actual living room.
Oh, I see.
The purpose is so that tomorrow, when you mentally walk past that couch, the couch acts as a physical tripwire, right? A retrieval cue that forces you to remember the apple.
But pop culture has completely exaggerated this. The fictional portrayals make it look like you have an infallible, permanent video recording of your entire past.
Oh yeah, the DVR memory.
Right. The detective just closes his eyes, navigates to a mental filing cabinet, and reads the fine print of a contract he glanced at like 3 years ago.
Which is artistically brilliant for television, but scientifically, it is wildly inaccurate. Those fictional portrayals are combining dramatized introspection, free association, and flawless cinematic recall into one impossible superpower.
So real human memory doesn't work like a DVR.
Not even close. The method of loci provides retrieval cues. It does not create a searchable, pixel-perfect database of your entire sensory history.
And when popular culture frames it that way, it just sets people up to fail.
It creates incredibly toxic expectations for everyday learners. People try it, realize they can't instantly play back yesterday's breakfast in 4K resolution, and they just assume their brain is broken or they failed the technique.
So let me see if I have this straight. If my brain is a completely chaotic, messy computer desktop right now.
Which is most of us.
Right. Then the method of loci is like finally creating properly labeled folders to put my specific files in so I can actually find them later.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas the symbolic mind palace, that second category, is more like changing the desktop wallpaper to a picture of a serene forest because it helps me feel calm and centered when I look at the screen.
That is a brilliant analogy. Let's ground that with a contrast. Imagine you, the listener, are giving a major presentation at work. You use the method of loci by taking the key points of your quarterly report and mentally placing them around your physical living room.
Okay, so point 1 is on the couch.
Point 2 is on the TV. Point 3 is by the window. The architecture there purely serves retrieval. You are asking your brain, where did I place the revenue data?
Right.
Now, contrast that with a symbolic inner landscape. Say you are feeling overwhelmed, so you close your eyes and imagine a mental control room on a spaceship.
Okay, I like that.
You imagine a captain at the wheel representing your executive decision-making and maybe a frantic engineer in the back representing your anxiety.
Yeah.
You aren't storing your grocery list there.
They're just trying to figure out why you're stressed.
Exactly. You are using that space to ask, how do I understand the emotional organization of my mind right now? Both are completely valid internal environments, but they serve entirely different psychological functions.
That makes perfect sense. The purpose dictates the structure. But I want to push back on the word palace for a second.
Sure.
Does it actually have to be a grand, sweeping architectural marvel? Because frankly, if I'm already stressed out trying to memorize things for a meeting, the idea of having to conceptually design a literal palace with marble columns and vaulted ceilings, that just sounds exhausting.
Not at all. And you bring up a great point. The phrase mind palace makes it sound much more grandiose and intimidating than it actually is.
Yeah, it sounds like too much work.
The essential feature is just stable, spatial order. It doesn't have to be a building at all. It can be your daily bus route to work, the layout of the childhood home you grew up in, a sequence of familiar shops in your neighborhood.
Or even parts of the human body, right?
Exactly. As long as there is a reliable, learned sequence of locations that your brain already knows effortlessly, it works.
Okay, so if this isn't just some Silicon Valley productivity hack and it doesn't require me to be a master architect, where did human beings actually come up with this?
It's actually a great story.
Because looking through the historical record, it seems like we're dealing with something profoundly ancient.
It is incredibly ancient. The history of this technique is generally divided into 5 major phases. And what is truly fascinating here is how the purpose of the technique mutated over time to adapt to the specific information culture of whatever era it found itself in.
Oh, that's a cool way to look at it.
Yeah, and it starts in ancient Greece.
Yes. The legendary origin story, I absolutely love this. It centers on a lyric poet named Simonides of Chios.
A classic tale.
So picture this. It's ancient Greece, and Simonides is attending this lavish banquet hosted by a nobleman in Thessaly. He's there performing poetry. And at some point during the meal, he gets called outside for a moment.
Just a random stroke of luck.
Totally. And while he is standing outside, catastrophe strikes. The roof of the banquet hall suddenly collapses, crushing absolutely everyone inside.
It's awful.
The historical accounts say the bodies were so badly mangled by the stone and debris that the relatives who came to claim them couldn't even identify their own loved ones.
It is a profoundly horrific scene. But in the midst of that tragedy, Simonides realizes something incredible about his own cognition.
What happened?
He closes his eyes and realizes he can mentally reconstruct the exact spatial arrangement of the banquet. He remembers who was sitting at which table, who was lounging on which couch.
Wow.
Yeah. By remembering the locations, he was able to systematically identify the victims for the grieving families.
Now, obviously, we have to note for the listeners that we don't know if this exact event happened precisely this way. Writers like Cicero recorded it centuries later.
Right. It might be a bit apocryphal.
But whether it's absolute historical fact or a bit of myth-making, it operates as the founding legend for a reason. It captures the core formula perfectly. A stable place plus an ordered position equals a retrieval structure.
Exactly. The key insight is that Simonides didn't remember the guests in a vacuum. He didn't just have a floating list of names in his head.
Right.
He remembered the relationship between the person and their physical position in the room. And this moves us perfectly into the second phase, which is Roman codification.
The Romans loved systems.
They did. They took this poetic insight and turned it into a rigorous, almost industrial system for rhetoric and public speaking. We have these incredible surviving texts from Cicero, from Quintilian, and a very famous anonymous instructional manual called the Rhetorica ad Herennium.
Yes, the Rhetorica ad Herennium, and it uses a metaphor that I think is just brilliant.
Oh, the wax tablets.
Yeah, it compares the mental locations in your mind to wax tablets, which were the everyday notebooks of the Roman era, and it compares the imagined images you place there to the written letters.
Which tells us everything we need to know about how they viewed the brain. They were thinking of the mind as an internalized technology of inscription.
Oh, I love that phrasing, internalized technology.
Right, because you have to remember the context of the era. A Roman senator or lawyer couldn't pull up a PowerPoint presentation. They couldn't easily carry a searchable database of notes on parchment because parchment was expensive and cumbersome.
So they had to rely entirely on themselves.
To be powerful, knowledge had to be available inside the speaker to allow for flexible debate, immediate recall, and spontaneous composition. The mind was the only database available.
Let me stop you right there. If this technique was the ultimate intellectual life hack of the ancient world, why isn't it taught in every elementary school today?
Well, that's a complicated question.
Did the invention of the printing press just instantly kill the memory palace? Because suddenly we could just write everything down in standardized, reproducible books? I mean, why do all this mental heavy lifting if you can just check an index?
That is a very common assumption, and honestly, it is a massive oversimplification of history. The printing press definitely changed the landscape, but books and memory coexisted and actually complemented each other for a long time.
Okay, so when did that happen?
This brings us to the third phase, the Middle Ages. During this era, memory wasn't just viewed as a sterile warehouse for facts. It was a workshop for the soul.
A workshop for the soul. That's heavy.
Monks and scholastic philosophers, most notably Thomas Aquinas, tied the act of memory directly to the virtue of prudence.
Prudence, like moral judgment. How does memorizing things make you a better person?
Well, for Aquinas and his contemporaries, remembering the past with intense clarity was considered a prerequisite for judging the present and acting wisely in the future.
Oh, so you couldn't be wise if you didn't have a clear record of the past.
Exactly. You didn't just memorize scripture so you could parrot it back. You internalized it. You placed it in your mental architecture so you could constantly walk past it, meditate upon it, and allow it to form your moral character.
That is fascinating.
Books provided the raw material, sure, but that material had to be consumed, assembled, and digested inside the mind to be of any real value. The printing press didn't replace that internal moral workshop.
Okay, I see. It's the difference between having a cookbook on your shelf and actually knowing how to cook.
Great analogy.
Which brings us to the fourth phase, the Renaissance. And this is where things get incredibly ambitious, almost to the point of madness. They aren't just memorizing speeches or Bible verses anymore. They are trying to map the entire universe.
This is undoubtedly the most mind-bending era of the technique. Renaissance humanists rediscovered these classical Roman texts and tried to elevate the memory palace into a universal encyclopedia of all human knowledge.
Like who?
Well, you have figures like Giulio Camillo, who designed a literal physical structure called the memory theater, but it was inverted.
Right. Instead of the audience sitting in the seats watching the stage, the user would stand alone on the stage, looking out at the audience seating area. And those seats were divided into highly specific levels and gates, filled with mythological and planetary images, designed to categorize the entire structure of the universe and all human history.
It was essentially an attempt to build a 16th century search engine using physical space and imagination. And then Giordano Bruno comes along and takes it even further.
Oh yeah, Bruno.
Bruno created these incredibly complex rotating combinatorial wheels.
Okay, I really want to drill down into Bruno's wheels because this gave me a massive aha moment when I was reading the research. He wasn't just storing static facts, right?
Exactly. Bruno combined classical memory places, letters of the alphabet, mythological figures, and zodiac imagery, and he placed them on concentric wheels that could theoretically be rotated in the mind.
In his mind. That's just wild.
The outer wheel might represent a subject, the middle wheel an action, the inner wheel an object. By
Yes.
rotating the wheels, you combine concepts in novel ways.
So he was generating new ideas with it.
He was basically building a 16th century mechanical AI inside his head. He used it not just to store information, but to generate new philosophical truths by seeing how different concepts aligned when the wheels turned.
It's staggering to think about the mental horsepower required to operate that. But it also proves that this technique isn't just a Western phenomenon, right? Because we have the story of Matteo Ricci.
Yes, Matteo Ricci was an Italian Jesuit missionary who took this highly developed European architectural mnemonic to Ming Dynasty China in 1596.
Okay.
But here is the fascinating part. He couldn't just hand the Chinese scholars a Roman villa or an Italian cathedral. He had to adapt the technique to a completely different information culture.
Because Ming China was dominated by the incredibly demanding civil service exams, right? And they used written Chinese characters, which are practically visual images themselves.
Precisely. Ricci had to translate the method to accommodate the Chinese writing system and the specific demands of their educational environment.
So the technique is flexible.
Extremely. It proves that the underlying neurological mechanism of the method of loci is universal across cultures, but the application of it is deeply dependent on the local linguistic and educational environment.
And finally, that historical journey brings us to the fifth phase, the modern era. Obviously, the memory palace lost its central institutional role as filing cabinets, printed encyclopedias, and eventually the internet took over.
Right, it became a bit of a lost art.
But it was rediscovered in a major way. Historians like Francis Yates brought the intellectual history back to light in 1966. Cognitive psychologists started putting it in MRI machines, and today, memory athletes use these exact same Roman techniques to memorize thousands of digits of pi or shuffled decks of cards in seconds.
So when you look at the sweeping history, it proves the technique's enduring power and flexibility. It evolved from a survival tool to identify victims, to a political tool for public speaking, to a meditative practice for internalizing virtue, to a Renaissance attempt to map reality, and finally, to a modern competitive sport in cognitive science subject.
Okay, I am completely sold on the history. It is epic. But if you're listening to this right now, you probably don't need to map the cosmos or recite a 3-hour Roman legal defense.
Probably not, no.
You just need to remember your talking points for a meeting or what you need from the grocery store. How do we actually do this today? Let's move from ancient theory to practical blueprinting.
Well, to build a functional memory palace, you need 5 core elements. If you miss one, the structure collapses.
Okay, what are they?
First, you need a stable environment. Second, a fixed route through that environment. Third, distinct loci or stopping points along that route. Fourth, you need interacting images or associations that represent your facts. And fifth, you need a retrieval journey where you mentally walk that exact same route again to pick the facts back up.
Let's focus on those loci, those stopping points, because the research warns about some major beginner errors here. You can't just pick a blank white wall or 3 identical dining chairs, right?
No, absolutely not.
If you're on your commute listening to this and you think, oh, I'll use the bus stops, but every bus stop looks exactly the same, that's going to fail.
That will absolutely fail. Ambiguity is the enemy of retrieval. If you choose 3 identical chairs in your dining room, your brain will eventually confuse the items placed on them.
Like, wait, was the quarterly revenue on the middle chair or the left chair?
Exactly. The locations must be distinct, they must be fixed in position, and they need to be large enough to host an imagined interaction. Furthermore, you cannot just throw 10 complex facts into one chaotic pile on your kitchen table.
Right, keep it organized.
The foundational advice is to assign one principal idea per locus, at least until you become highly advanced.
But the loci are just the empty shelves. The magic is what you put on them. And this brings up the mechanics of the images themselves. The science calls it associative binding.
Yes.
And this is where it clicked for me. You aren't just juxtaposing an item in a location, you are forcing them to interact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Let's walk the listener through this, using a classic 10-item grocery list example from the research. Suppose the first item on your list is bread, and your very first locus, your starting point, is your front gate.
Okay, so a weak association is just imagining a loaf of bread sitting quietly next to the gate.
Right. A strong association, true associative binding, is imagining that the iron gate itself has been magically transformed into two enormous, steaming hot slices of soft bread.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. As you try to open the gate, your hands sink deep into the crust, melted butter runs down your arms, and maybe a flock of seagulls dive bombs you to steal chunks of it.
Okay, that is incredibly visceral. I can almost smell it. So then you move to locus 2, which is your front steps, and the second item is milk.
So you don't just picture a carton. You imagine a rushing, roaring waterfall of ice-cold milk pouring down those concrete steps, splashing everywhere, making them dangerously slippery as you try to climb up.
Then you reach the front door, which is locus 3, and your item is apples.
You picture a barrage of giant red apples pounding against the wooden door from the inside, hitting it so hard they leave massive, apple-shaped dents splintering the wood.
You unlock the door, you walk inside to the entryway rug. Locus 4, item 4 is eggs.
The rug is completely covered in bowling ball-sized eggs. There's no way around them.
Oh, gross.
As you step on the rug, the eggs shatter with a deafening, sickening crack, and thick, sticky yellow yolk glues your shoes to the floor.
You finally pry your shoes free and open the coat closet. Locus 5. The item is coffee.
You yank the closet door open, and millions of hot, freshly roasted coffee beans explode out of the sleeves of all your coats, burying you in an avalanche of beans. And the smell of espresso is so intense and overpowering, it literally makes your eyes water.
Okay, I am literally never going to forget that list. The butter, the milk waterfall, the dents in the door, but those are all highly concrete objects. Bread is bread. What if I am a student studying economics or a professional analyzing market trends? How do I place inflation on my couch? It's just a vague, abstract, upward trending graph in a textbook.
This is where the technique requires a bit of intellectual creativity. You have to add an extra step of translation. You must convert the abstract concept into a decodable concrete symbol.
So no graphs.
For inflation, you can't picture a graph. Instead, you might imagine a giant, green, crinkling dollar bill sitting on your couch. But it's inflating like a massive hot air balloon.
Okay, I can picture that.
It's stretching the fabric of the couch, and as it floats up toward the ceiling, it grabs your grocery bags and lifts them completely out of your reach.
That is brilliant because it perfectly captures the mechanism and the consequence of inflation money expanding and purchasing power physically floating away from you.
Exactly. It has embedded meaning.
But I have a bone to pick with the traditional advice on this imagery. I read that a lot of memory champions say you must make the images bizarre, highly violent, or extremely sexual to remember them.
Right, that's the classical advice.
So do I really need to fill my mental living room with bloody explosions and decapitations just to remember the Federal Reserve's interest rate?
It's an excellent question, and it's a debate that goes back centuries. The classical texts, like the Rhetorica ad Herennium, absolutely recommended exceptional beauty, extreme ugliness, blood, or grotesque comic effects.
Because it grabs your attention.
Yes, the Roman mind understood that human attention is naturally hijacked by the extreme. However, modern cognitive research introduces a much more nuanced concept called the generation effect.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
The evidence shows that the most effective images aren't universally standardized, and they don't have to be universally shocking. They are the ones uniquely generated by the user.
So personal relevance actually trumps generic shock value.
Precisely. Emotion and distinctiveness certainly matter. But a quiet, tender, highly nostalgic image involving a beloved childhood pet can dramatically outperform a generic bloody explosion if the pet image decodes better for your specific brain.
The decoding is the most important part.
The image must be distinctive, yes, but above all else, it must be decodable. If you imagine a spectacular explosion on your couch, but tomorrow you look at that explosion and can't figure out how to translate it back into the word inflation, your mnemonic has completely failed.
Which brings up a great warning I saw in the research about mnemonic over-engineering.
Oh, yes. That's a trap.
It's this trap where you spend 3 hours meticulously designing the architectural molding of your mental library, agonizing over the perfect metaphor for a concept, color coordinating your mental folders, and you realize you haven't actually studied the material at all.
Exactly. If you're spending significantly more time building the system than you are learning the content, your memory palace has just devolved into a very elaborate, highly intellectual form of procrastination.
We've all been there with fancy stationery.
Yes. A crude, ugly cue that quickly and reliably retrieves the memory is infinitely better than a beautiful, poetic cue that doesn't work. The architecture must always serve the retrieval, not the other way around.
Okay, so I've built the palace. I've populated it with these visceral, personally generated, dripping with butter images. I can visualize it perfectly. But I want to know what is physically happening in my gray matter when I do this.
Let's get into the neuroscience.
Yeah, when I imagine that exploding coffee closet, what is my brain actually doing?
The first, most important thing to understand from a neuroscientific perspective is that there is no single memory palace module in the brain.
There's no one spot for it.
Right. If a neurosurgeon opened up your skull, they couldn't point to a specific lump of tissue and say, ah, there is the palace. Instead, the technique relies on forcibly recruiting a highly coordinated network of brain regions that usually operate semi-independently.
Let's break down that network. How do the different parts interact?
Think of it like a film production. Your perihippocampal cortex is the location scout. Its job is to process scenes, spatial layouts, and environmental contexts. It provides the stage.
Okay, the stage.
Then you have the retrosplenial cortex, which acts like the camera operator. It deals with your orientation and viewpoints within that space, making sure you know which way you are facing.
Got it. What about the movement?
The caudate nucleus is the choreographer. It is heavily involved in habit formation and practice rote sequences, moving you from locus 1 to locus 2.
And who is in charge?
Finally, the hippocampus is the director. Its primary role is episodic and relational memory. It takes the stage, the camera angle, the movement, and the facts, and glues them all together.
The research highlighted a specific fMRI study from 2026 that completely blew my mind. It focused on the default mode network, or the DMN.
Ah, yes, the DMN.
Usually when I hear about the DMN, it's associated with daydreaming, mind-wandering, or zoning out during a boring meeting. But in this context, it's doing something structural.
Yes, this is one of the most exciting recent discoveries. The 2026 study found that the DMN is highly active when you build a memory palace, and it helps construct the idiosyncratic, meaningful stories that link an arbitrary item to a locus.
So it's the storyteller.
Exactly. When you imagine the giant apples denting your front door, your brain isn't just taking a static Polaroid photograph. The DMN is actively generating a narrative. It turns isolated data into a rich, spatial, sequential episode.
I think the literature calls this a conjunctive representation. It's not just an item sitting next to a location. The brain fuses them.
They become one thing.
Right. It synthesizes a brand new memory where the apples, the door, the sound of the splintering wood, and your physical perspective are all combined into one cohesive event model.
Exactly. And that is why it is so powerful. Compare that to ordinary rehearsal, where you just pace around your room repeating to yourself, bread, milk, apples, eggs, coffee.
Which is how most of us study, unfortunately.
Right. In ordinary rehearsal, those words are fragile, they have no context, no sensory weight, and they actively compete with each other for your attention.
But with the
In the memory palace, the DMN tricks the brain into treating that random list of groceries as if it were a profound, lived, autobiographical event. And the human brain evolved over millions of years to remember lived events, not abstract lists.
Okay, I have to ask about a specific debate in the neuroscience community that keeps popping up online. Theta oscillations.
Oh boy.
You see all these clickbait articles claiming, boost your memory by increasing your theta waves with this one weird trick. Or selling binaural beats to give you a memory palace brain. What is actually going on there?
You are right to be highly skeptical of that. It is a massive pop science oversimplification. Brain activity is rhythmic, and theta waves are indeed often associated with spatial navigation and memory tasks in mammals.
So there's a grain of truth?
A grain, yes. But the research on human memory athletes is incredibly complex and contradictory. Some studies show an increase in theta activity during successful memory encoding, which makes sense intuitively.
Right.
But other rigorous studies show a decrease in theta power during these same tasks.
Wait, how could a decrease in brain activity mean someone is better at a memory task? Wouldn't a memory champion's brain be lighting up like a Christmas tree on an fMRI?
You would intuitively think so, but in neuroscience, more activation does not always mean better processing. As a person becomes highly trained in the method of loci, their neural processing becomes significantly more efficient.
Oh, like muscle memory in sports.
Think of it exactly like a professional athlete executing a perfect jump shot. A beginner is tense, using too many muscles, wasting massive amounts of energy. Their brain and body are overactive.
Right.
The professional's movement is smooth, isolated, and expends incredibly little wasted energy. The decrease in certain brain activations in memory experts often indicates that their brain has become a highly efficient machine. It doesn't need to work as hard to store the data.
That makes total sense, but let me pause you because I want to make sure I am not taking the spatial metaphor too literally here. When we say the hippocampus stores a cognitive map, what does that actually mean?
It's a great distinction to make.
Is it literally a map? Like if we go back to that neurosurgeon, would they find a tiny physical library with miniature books inside my hippocampus?
Absolutely not, and that is a critical distinction that often gets lost in translation. The term cognitive map is purely a representational metaphor.
So it's not a physical object.
No, it describes how the brain mathematically and chemically organizes relationships, knowing that A is next to B and B leads to C. The locations in your mind palace, the couch, the door, the closet, they are purely retrieval cues.
Okay.
They are not physical storage containers. Using a memory palace changes the access route to the information, giving you a reliable path to find it. But it does not change the physical storage format in your neurons. Your brain doesn't suddenly sprout a tiny couch in the temporal lobe.
Okay, so the brain scans look impressive, the DMN storytelling is fascinating, and neural efficiency sounds great in theory. But we have to look at the hard data.
Let's do it.
Does this actually translate to measurable real-world success? If I am a law student taking the bar exam or an executive presenting to a board of directors, is all this effort going to actually move the needle?
The short answer is yes, absolutely, but with some very important caveats that the hype often ignores. According to massive meta-analyses published in 2021 and 2025, training in the method of loci produces a medium effect size, which is statistically calculated at around G equals 0.65.
Let's translate that for those of us who aren't statisticians. What does an effect size of 0.65 mean for a normal person trying to learn?
In practical terms, it means that, on average, a group of people trained in the method of loci will noticeably and consistently outperform a group of people using ordinary rote rehearsal. It's a statistically significant advantage.
But it's not a magic pill.
No. It does not mean that every single person will improve their memory by exactly 65%. And crucially, it excels most at a very specific type of cognitive task.
Which is?
Immediate serial recall of ordered lists.
So if I need to memorize the 10 structural points of a speech, or the chronological timeline of a historical event, or a list of vocabulary words in a specific order, it's incredibly powerful.
Yes, it is unmatched for that.
Yeah.
But, and this is a huge but, it does not make you a genius overnight.
Yeah.
And this brings up a massive point in the psychological literature about near transfer versus far transfer.
Let's dig into that, because I feel like this is where the memory palace gets overpromised.
Exactly. Near transfer means that training in one specific memory task makes you better at a very similar, closely related memory task.
Okay.
Line palace training definitely shows near transfer. If you train by memorizing playing cards, you will probably also be better at memorizing a grocery list.
Because it's the same fundamental skill.
Right. But far transfer would mean that memorizing a deck of cards magically increases your general underlying intelligence, or makes you inherently better at unrelated cognitive tasks, like complex math problem solving or spatial reasoning in a video game.
Does it do this?
The scientific evidence for far transfer is extremely weak. A memory palace is a specialized cognitive strategy. It is not a universal hardware upgrade to your brain's working memory capacity.
I want to bring up the active cognitive training project because when I read about this in the research, it honestly frustrated me.
It's a sobering study.
They took older adults, trained them extensively in these memory techniques, and while many of them showed great improvement and even retained the skill for years, a massive portion of them just completely stopped using it spontaneously in their daily lives.
Yeah, they just dropped it.
Hold on, you're telling me we spent all this time proving it works, proving it changes the brain, and people just quit? Why bother talking about this if it's too exhausting for normal people to use?
Your frustration is completely valid, and it points to the central limitation of the technique. It requires high cognitive effort.
It's just hard work.
Building a palace, selecting loci, generating bizarre symbols, and actively maintaining the routes takes intense focus, time, and mental energy. It is not an effortless process. For an older adult or, frankly, busy professional, the cognitive cost of building a palace, just to remember where they put their keys or what to buy at the store, simply outweighs the benefit.
It is easier to write it on a Post-it note.
Exactly. Which brings up the study of the 78 medical students learning about endocrinology, specifically insulin and diabetes.
Yes, this was fascinating. They split the students up. The group that used the method of loci scored an average of 9.31 out of 10 on their assessment, while the control group using standard study methods scored 8.10.
Significant difference.
On paper, that seems like a massive win for the Mind Palace. They crushed the control group.
It is absolutely a win for academic recall. But the researchers are very careful to point out a critical caveat. Remembering the exact names and sequential order of 5 interacting hormones does not automatically equal deep clinical comprehension.
Right. You might know the sequence flawlessly because you put the hormones on your living room furniture.
Exactly.
But if a patient walks into the ER in diabetic ketoacidosis, presenting with novel, overlapping symptoms you've never seen before, knowing the sequence of hormones doesn't mean you have the clinical reasoning to save their life.
Exactly. The mnemonic has not given you true medical reasoning. What the Memory Palace does do is support baseline recall, which theoretically frees up your brain's working memory to focus on the reasoning because you aren't struggling to remember the raw facts.
You don't have to look them up.
Right. But the Palace cannot replace the hard, grueling work of true conceptual understanding.
So what does this all mean? Bring all this together. If this requires so much cognitive effort, and I have a smartphone in my pocket right now with access to the entirety of human knowledge in 3 seconds, why should I, or anyone listening, bother building a mind palace at all?
The research provides a very practical decision rule for this exact modern dilemma. You should not use a mind palace for disposable facts that you can safely and quickly Google.
So don't memorize trivia.
Don't build a palace for a recipe you'll cook once. You should use it when information must be recalled sequentially without the opportunity to search.
Like public speaking.
Like delivering a persuasive speech while maintaining constant eye contact with an audience. You use it when you need an internalized mental framework to structure further thought, like a lawyer needing the timeline of a case in their head to cross-examine a witness spontaneously.
Or a pilot in an emergency.
Yes, or for emergency procedures where a 3-second delay to check your phone could be disastrous. The rule of thumb is leave exact citations, complex data tables, and disposable trivia to external databases, but use your internal architecture for the conceptual scaffolding of your daily expertise.
Okay, that grocery list exercise earlier worked beautifully for me because I can vividly picture the butter, the milk, the apples. But as you were talking, I realized a major flaw here.
What's that?
What if I can't picture things? What if my mind's eye is just blank? Because the data proves it works, but the subjective feeling of doing it must vary wildly from person to person.
It varies tremendously, and this is a fascinating area of cognitive science. Mental imagery is not just a single volume dial in the brain that goes from faint to photographic.
It's more complicated than that.
It is a highly complex spectrum that varies in clarity, control, stability, and sensory modality. In the deep dive literature, we see 2 absolute extremes. Hyperphantasia, which is extremely vivid, intensely perception-like imagery, essentially seeing things as clearly in your mind as you do with your physical eyes.
And the other side.
And aphantasia, which is the complete or near-complete absence of voluntary visual imagery.
When I first heard about aphantasia, I instantly assumed those people were completely locked out of this technique. I mean, if you can't see your couch in your mind's eye, how on earth can you put an inflating green dollar bill on it? It seems impossible.
That is the most common misconception, and it is entirely false. Aphantasia is not an inability to use spatial memory.
Wait, really?
Yes. The research explains a crucial fundamental difference in the brain between object imagery and spatial imagery. Object imagery is the ability to see the color, texture, shading, and visual details of an apple.
Okay.
Spatial imagery is simply knowing where the apple is located in 3D space, regardless of whether you can see its color.
So someone with aphantasia might not be able to picture the shiny red skin of the apple, but their brain still fundamentally understands the geometry of the room.
Exactly. People with aphantasia can successfully use spatial, conceptual, or verbal knowing to build a memory palace.
Right.
They don't see an elephant crushing their couch. They conceptually know that locus 6 is the couch, and they know an elephant is positioned there crushing it.
Oh, wow.
Their brain registers the spatial relationship without needing to render the graphics.
I see. It sounds like some people are playing a fully rendered 4K virtual reality game in their head, while others are just reading the raw green lines of code in the Matrix, but both players are successfully beating the level.
Yes, and sometimes the person reading the code actually has an advantage, which brings up the flip side. Hyperphantasia. Seeing things with 4K intensity isn't always a blessing.
Really? How so? I would think the more vivid, the better.
Imagine you place a memory cue in your kitchen. If you have hyperphantasia, you might get distracted by the beautifully rendered reflections of sunlight on the kitchen tiles, or the exact shade of the granite countertops, and you lose focus on the target information you were supposed to remember.
So you get distracted by your own imagination.
Or worse, an old, hyper-vivid image might be so burned into your mind that it refuses to fade away, making it impossible to overwrite that location with a new fact the next week.
The subjective experience isn't just visual either, right? The text outlines all these other sensory modalities we can tap into.
Right, you can use all your senses.
There's auditory imagery, like we mentioned earlier, encoding the name bell, not by picturing a physical bell, but by imagining a deafening, painful ringing sound in your ears when you walk past the locus.
Yeah. Exactly. Auditory, tactile, olfactory, smelling that espresso. And there's also the concept of perspective, which drastically changes the subjective experience.
Like first person versus third person.
Are you walking through your memory palace in first person, looking through your own eyes, experiencing it bodily? Or are you in third-person observer perspective, floating above and watching yourself move through the rooms like a character in a video game?
The research categorized them as the vivid navigator versus the map viewer.
Right. The vivid navigator experiences a highly embodied first-person multisensory journey. The map viewer looks down from above and accesses the rooms purely as abstract geometric categories.
And both work.
Both are perfectly valid. The ultimate takeaway from the psychological research is this. Behavioral success matters far more than subjective visual richness. The best mnemonic is the one that successfully retrieves the fact when you need it, not the one that wins an Oscar for internal special effects.
But building this intense, multi-sensory inner world, whether you are a navigator or a map viewer, it can feel incredibly real. And if you spend a lot of time in there, it raises some serious questions.
It does.
When does an active imagination cross the line into something we should be clinically worried about?
This is a critical area of the deep dive, and the source material carefully navigates the clinical nuances. Because you are right, creating a deeply immersive inner world sounds suspiciously like some psychiatric symptoms.
Right.
We have to clearly distinguish a healthy, intentional mind palace from generalized mind-wandering, clinical dissociation, maladaptive daydreaming, or even hallucinations.
So how do psychologists test that?
The functional test used by psychologists asks a few key defining questions. Is the experience deliberate? Is it controllable? And most importantly, does it support your daily functioning in the real world, or does it impair it?
Let's talk about maladaptive daydreaming, because just spending a lot of time in your head isn't necessarily a disorder, right? I mean, authors, artists, and inventors spend hours lost in their own imaginations.
Correct. You can have a deeply immersive paracosm, a highly detailed fantasy world that brings you immense joy, fuels your creativity, and helps you relax. That is perfectly healthy.
So when does it turn bad?
It becomes maladaptive daydreaming when it begins to feel compulsive, when it repeatedly resists your attempts to stop, and when it actively replaces important real-life activities.
Oh, like checking out of your real life.
If you retreat into your memory palace or inner landscape to avoid real-world relationships, ignore your responsibilities, or if being pulled out of it causes you significant psychological distress, that is when it crosses the boundary from a cognitive tool to a clinical issue.
The text also addresses extreme conditions like dissociative identity disorder, or DID, and it contrasts DID with therapeutic frameworks like internal family systems or dialogical self-theory. This is something I really want to clarify. If I build a symbolic mind palace and I decide to put a council of advisors in there to help me make decisions, say, I imagine a cautious accountant sitting at a table representing my financial fear and a bold explorer representing my ambition, I haven't suddenly fractured my personality, have I?
No, absolutely not. You have created a very healthy, structured metacognitive tool. Using parts, personas, or internal roles is a widely accepted psychological method to make complex, overwhelming internal conflicts easier to examine.
So it's just a tool to look at myself.
You are simply personifying your competing motives so you can look at them objectively. In clinically significant dissociation, like DIO, there are recurrent memory gaps, identity changes that drastically disrupt daily functioning, and a profound loss of personal agency.
That sounds completely different.
Deliberately role-playing a council meeting in your head is a conscious, structured exercise. It does not mean you literally contain multiple independent organisms.
Okay, but let me push back on that a little bit. What if one of those imaginary council members says something that totally surprises me?
What do you mean?
If I sit down at my mental table, ask the cautious accountant for advice on a career move, and he gives me a brilliant, cutting insight that I hadn't consciously planned out, doesn't that imply he has a mind of his own? Where did that thought come from if I didn't consciously author it?
It feels incredibly surprising phenomenologically. It feels like it came from outside of you. But neurobiologically, your brain is just doing what it evolved to do, simulate complex scenarios.
So my brain is just doing math behind the scenes.
Think about it. You have built a robust psychological model of this cautious accountant. You implicitly know his values, his vocabulary, his fears. When you ask him a question, your brain rapidly generates a response consistent with that complex model without you needing to consciously, painstakingly pre-plan every single syllable.
That makes sense.
It feels like a sudden surprise, an intervention from another entity, but it is entirely self-generated by your own predictive processing networks.
That is fascinating. It's like your brain is running a background simulation and handing you the result. But speaking of things hiding in the background, the text raises a massive flashing red flag about using mind palaces to uncover presumed hidden trauma.
Yes.
It specifically and repeatedly warns against trying to access repressed or recovered memories through intense visualization.
And this is perhaps the most important safety warning in the entire body of literature. This raises a fundamental question about the nature of human memory itself.
Because memory isn't a video recording?
As we established, human memory is reconstructive. It is not a literal video recording sitting in a vault waiting to be played back. If you repeatedly imagine a vivid scene in your mind palace, say, you imagine a locked door at the end of a dark hallway, and you assume that door must hold a dark, repressed secret from your childhood, you can experience a well-documented psychological phenomenon called imagination inflation.
Imagination inflation, meaning the more you imagine it, the more real it feels.
Exactly. Repeated intense visualization of a fictional or suggested event can make that event feel incredibly familiar to the brain, eventually creating a completely false sense of historical accuracy.
Oh, wow. So you invent a memory.
A locked room in your mental landscape might just symbolize ordinary, mundane forgetting, or it might just be a creative mystery your brain generated because you watch too many true crime shows.
It doesn't have to be a dark secret.
There is no universal Freudian dictionary where a locked mental door automatically equals repressed trauma. Using these intense visualization techniques to actively dig for uncorroborated trauma without professional guidance is scientifically dangerous and can lead to the creation of false memories.
We also need to separate the feeling of deep, intense absorption in these spaces from pathological dissociation. The text compares derealization, where the physical world around you feels distant, flat, or fake, and depersonalization, feeling detached from your own body like you are a robot, with the healthy dual awareness of a mind palace.
When you are successfully and safely using a mind palace, you maintain dual awareness, with absolute certainty that you are mentally walking through a grand imaginary hallway while simultaneously knowing you're physically sitting in a chair in your living room.
You never lose track of reality.
You might be deeply absorbed in the mental image, very much like getting lost in a fantastic novel or a movie, but your reality testing remains completely intact. You don't actually believe the physical world has vanished, and you can pull yourself out at any time.
So to summarize this incredible, expansive journey we've been on today, the method of loci, the memory palace, is a scientifically validated, historically rich, and highly personal cognitive framework.
It really is.
It isn't magic, it isn't a superpower, and it isn't a photographic memory. It is a rigorous technique that forces you to take arbitrary floating data and turn it into meaningful spatial stories, anchoring those stories to physical locations your brain already knows how to navigate.
Exactly. It forces you to actually pay attention to the material, to deeply elaborate on the meaning of the information, and to create reliable, well-worn retrieval pathways.
It's just a better way to study.
It shifts the heavy burden of memory away from grueling rote repetition and moves it into the realm of creative spatial association.
If you are listening to this right now, I want to challenge you to try this today. Start small. Don't build the Roman Colosseum. Pick 10 distinct locations, loci, in your current home.
A simple route.
Make a logical, continuous path. Say from your front door to the entryway rug, to the coat closet, into the kitchen, to the fridge, to the stove. Then take your next to-do list or your grocery list and encode it.
Have fun with it.
Force the items to interact with those locations in bizarre, multisensory ways. Melt them, explode them, make them scream. Walk the path, test yourself immediately, and see how that spatial scaffold catches the information before it can fall out of your head.
And as we close, I want to connect this deep dive to a broader, forward-looking idea that the text hints at, which I found profoundly thought-provoking.
Oh, let's hear it.
The source material briefly mentions that modern virtual reality spaces can actually be used as highly effective memory palaces.
That makes total sense.
We are rapidly moving into an era of augmented reality and spatial computing. With devices like modern VR headsets, our digital interfaces are no longer flat screens. They are literally being built around us in 3D space. You can pin a web browser to your physical kitchen wall and a spreadsheet to your physical desk.
We are essentially externalizing the method of loci.
Exactly. We are building a digital, automated method of loci all around us. We are projecting our memory onto the physical world using technology. But this raises a vital, almost philosophical question for the future.
What's that?
If we outsource our spatial memory entirely to technology, if we rely on headsets to pin our data to the wall, and GPS to constantly tell us how to navigate our cities, do we lose that internal cognitive map?
Oh, wow.
And if we look back at Thomas Aquinas, who believed that internal memory was the foundation of prudence and moral character, what happens to us?
That is a wild, slightly terrifying thought. If Aquinas was right, and memory is the internal workshop where we forge our morality and our narrative identity, what happens when we let the headset do the remembering? Does the internal workshop just shut down?
It's a big question.
That is definitely something for you to mull over the next time you put on a VR headset or blindly follow a GPS route without looking at the road. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We've explored ancient Greek ruins, Renaissance theaters, and the intricate neural pathways of your own mind. Keep exploring, keep building, and we will see you next time.